My cousin falsely accused me. 10 years later, she goes missing, and now my family thinks I did it. Hello, read it. There's a moment in every person's life when they realize that the things they thought were unshakable, family, trust, stability, can disappear in an instant. That moment doesn't come with a warning. It doesn't give you time to prepare. It just happens, and before you even understand what's going on, you're left standing in the wreckage of what used to be your life, trying to piece together how everything went so wrong. For me, that moment came when I was 19 years old. But looking back, I can see that the foundation had been cracking long before it finally collapsed. My name is Ethan Hayes, and for most of my life, I thought I had a good family. Not perfect, because no family ever is, but good. My parents were the type who didn't show affection easily, but they were always there. Strict, but present. My father was a man who believed in hard work and discipline. A former military officer who carried himself with a quiet authority that made people listen when he spoke. My mother was softer, more reserved, but in her own way, just as demanding. They weren't warm people, but they had expectations. And as their only son, those expectations were placed squarely on me. Then there was my extended family. The aunts, uncles, cousins who made up the sprawling, chaotic network of people that turned holidays into loud, messy affairs. Summers were spent running through my uncle's backyard, chasing my cousins through the thick, humid heat while the adults sat around drinking beers and swapping stories about their youth. I was close to most of them, but there was one person in particular who I had always been closest to, my cousin Madison. Madison was a year younger than me, and we had grown up almost like siblings. Our mothers were sisters, which meant we spent countless weekends together. Sleepovers, birthday parties, shared vacations where we fought over who got the window seat in the car. We had inside jokes that no one else understood, secrets that we swore we'd take to our graves. She was the kind of person who could talk her way out of anything, who always knew exactly what to say to make people believe whatever she wanted them to believe. Charismatic, confident, the type of person who could lie to your face and make you thank her for it. But back then, I didn't see her like that. Back then, she was just Madison, my best friend, my closest family member, the one person I thought I could trust with anything. That trust was a mistake. The first real shift in my life happened around my senior year of high school. Up until then, I had always felt like I belonged. My parents were strict, but they were proud of me. My extended family was close, and while I wasn't the center of attention, I was never on the outside either. But something changed that year. It was subtle at first, so small that I barely noticed it. It started with my parents. The way they spoke to me felt different. The usual confidence in my father's voice when he talked about my future became more measured, as if he was choosing his words carefully. My mother, who had always been critical in a way that felt normal, suddenly became distant. Conversations that used to flow easily now felt forced, filled with awkward pauses where there had never been any before. Then there was my extended family. The shift there was even harder to ignore. Family gatherings, which had once been a constant, started happening without me. I would find out about a barbecue after it had already happened, hear my aunts reminiscing about a birthday party I wasn't invited to. When I asked my parents, they always had a reason. Oh, it was last minute, or we thought you were busy with school. I wasn't busy, and it wasn't last minute. The first time I felt truly unwelcome was at Thanksgiving that year. I had always looked forward to it. My uncle's house packed with people, laughter spilling into every room, the familiar warmth of tradition. But that year, the warmth was gone. When I walked through the door, the first thing I noticed was the way people looked at me. There was something strange in their eyes, something I couldn't quite place. A hesitation, a guardedness, like they weren't sure if I belonged there. Conversations died when I approached. My aunts, who used to pull me into suffocating hugs, barely acknowledged me. My uncles, who had always grilled me about football and my college plans, seemed more interested in their drinks. And Madison, who had once been my shadow, my closest confidant, barely spoke to me at all. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, I asked my mother what was going on. She gave me a tight-lipped smile and said everything was fine. But she didn't meet my eyes when she said it. By the time I turned 19, the distance had grown into a canyon. Family events became rare, then non-existent. The messages from my relatives stopped coming. My father, who had once spoken with certainty about my future, barely acknowledged me. My mother's glances became quick, like she was afraid to look at me for too long. And Madison was the worst of all. She had once been my closest friend. Now, she acted like I didn't exist. If we were in the same room, she ignored me. If I spoke to her, she answered with one-word responses, like I was a stranger she barely tolerated. The inside jokes, the laughter, the shared secrets gone. I kept asking myself what had changed. I racked my brain for an answer, replayed every conversation, every interaction, trying to pinpoint the exact moment things had turned. But there was nothing. No fight, no falling out, no betrayal that I was aware of. Just silence. Then came the night everything fell apart. The night that ripped my life away from me in an instant. The night that turned my own family against me. The night that made me leave and never look back. I don't think about it much anymore. I don't let myself. Because thinking about it means remembering the look on their faces, the way my father's voice had sounded when he told me to get out, the way my mother's lips had trembled, but she had said nothing to stop it. For 10 years, I have buried it. For 10 years, I have built a new life, one where the Hayes family doesn't exist. But yesterday, out of nowhere, a message from my mother appeared on my phone. After 10 years of silence, I stared at it for a long time, my chest tight, my mind racing with all the things I thought I had locked away forever. I thought I was done with them. But now, after all this time, they were reaching out, and I had no idea why. Some betrayals come like an explosion, loud, violent, immediate. Others are slower, creeping in like a shadow, unnoticed until it's too late. Looking back, I don't know which is worse. But I do know this. The night my life fell apart didn't start with shouting. It didn't start with accusations or threats or hands gripping my shoulders, shaking me, demanding the truth. It started with silence. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked into my uncle's house that evening. Normally, family gatherings were chaotic. Loud conversations overlapping, the smell of food thick in the air, my younger cousins running through the hallways, dodging the adults as they shouted at them to slow down. There was always movement, energy, warmth, even when there were tensions simmering beneath the surface. But not that night. That night, the warmth was gone. At first, I couldn't place it. People still greeted me, still said my name, but it felt off. Like they were just going through the motions, like they had already had a conversation about me before I arrived and were now deciding how to act. My aunts, who used to suffocate me with hugs, gave me a half-hearted pat on the shoulder before turning away. My uncles, who usually pulled me into long-winded discussions about work and sports and whatever nonsense they were invested in that week, barely acknowledged me. And then there were the looks. They were quick, but they were there. Glances exchanged across the room. Eyes flicking toward me, then away. Measured, careful, calculating. Like I was being watched. Like I was being judged. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was just overthinking, reading too much into normal interactions. But then I saw Madison, and everything inside me went still. She was standing with a group of our cousins, her arms crossed, a small, knowing smile on her face as she listened to someone speak. But the second she noticed me, the smile disappeared. It didn't fade, it just vanished like a mask being pulled away. Her body stiffened, her shoulders squared, and then, without a word, she turned her back to me. I felt the impact of it like a physical blow. Madison and I had been inseparable growing up. Even when things had started changing between me and the rest of the family, she had always been my constant, the one person I thought would never turn against me. But in that moment, she had made her choice clear. I wasn't her family anymore. I swallowed hard, pushing down the wave of unease that had settled in my stomach. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe I had done something to upset her and hadn't realized it. Maybe. Then I saw my father. He was standing in the hallway, arms crossed over his chest, watching me. Not angry, not irritated, something worse, indifferent. He told me to come inside. My stomach tightened as I followed him down the hall, away from the low hum of conversation, past the dining room where my younger cousin sat with plates of food, past the kitchen where my aunts whispered to each other in hushed voices. The further we walked, the colder the house felt. When I stepped into the room, my mother was already there, standing near the staircase. Her arms were wrapped around herself, her fingers gripping the sleeves of her sweater like she was holding herself together. Her expression was tight, unreadable, but her eyes were red. She had been crying. My uncle, Madison's father, was there too. He was standing near the dining table, his hands gripping the back of a chair, his jaw clenched so tightly that I thought his teeth might break. His entire body was rigid, coiled, like he was barely keeping himself from losing control. Something was wrong. The air was thick, pressing down on my chest, suffocating. No one spoke. No one moved. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, waiting, expecting something. Then my father finally spoke, and in one sentence, he shattered my entire world. I don't remember every detail of what was said after that. Some of it is a blur, pieces I've spent years trying to lock away, trying to forget. But there are some things you can't erase. I remember my uncle's rage, the way his face twisted with something close to hatred, his voice shaking as he spat out words I couldn't even fully process. I remember my mother's silence, how she stood there, unmoving, her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but never did. I remember the way my father didn't hesitate. There was no discussion, no questioning, no chance to explain. They had already made up their minds. I was already guilty in their eyes. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to breathe around the crushing weight in my chest. I tried to speak, to say something, to ask why. But the words never came, because it didn't matter. Nothing I said would change anything. The last thing I remember before leaving was Madison standing in the hallway, watching. She didn't cry. She didn't look guilty. She didn't look away. She just stood there, her expression blank, like she was watching something she had expected to happen, like she had been waiting for this moment. I walked out of that house with nothing but a duffel bag and a silence, so heavy I thought it might crush me. I don't remember the drive home. I don't remember packing my things. All I know is that by morning I was gone. I never went back. I never looked back. I built a new life, one where the Hayes family no longer existed. For 10 years, I convinced myself that I had moved on, that they were just a story from another life. And then, out of nowhere, my mother sent me a message. A decade of silence, and now she wanted to talk. I stared at the screen for a long time, my pulse steady but slow, cold. After everything they had done, after what they had put me through, now suddenly they wanted me back. And I knew whatever they wanted, it wasn't going to be good. For 10 years, I had told myself that my past was dead, that what happened that night was nothing more than a scar, ugly but healed, buried beneath layers of time and distance. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I had never truly let it go, because wounds like that don't heal. They just become part of you, shaping the way you move through the world, the way you trust, the way you sleep at night, knowing that everything you build can be taken from you in an instant. I hadn't seen or spoken to my family since the night I left. I had blocked every number, cut off every possible thread that might have tied me back to them. And they had never reached out. Not once. No messages. No phone calls. No apologies. As far as I was concerned, they had made their choice, and I had made mine. I had spent 10 years rebuilding myself from nothing, carving out a life that no longer had the stain of the Hayes name attached to it. But now, after all these years, they were trying to pull me back in. The message from my mother had come out of nowhere. I hadn't recognized the number at first. I had long since erased it from my contacts, but I knew who it was the moment I read the first few words. She hadn't said much, just that she needed to talk, that it was important. No apology. No acknowledgement of the years that had passed in silence. Just a simple request, as if we had spoken yesterday. I should have ignored it. I should have deleted the message and moved on, just like I had done for the last decade. But something about it unsettled me, a feeling deep in my gut telling me that this wasn't just a casual attempt at reconnection. There was a reason she was reaching out now, after all this time, and I needed to know what it was. I didn't respond. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in 10 years. I looked them up. I had made it a point to never check their social media, to never give myself the opportunity to see how their lives had moved on without me. But now, I was breaking that rule. I searched for my father first, knowing he would be the easiest to find. He was never the type to stay offline, always wanting to appear like the perfect man with the perfect family. But when I found his profile, my stomach twisted. His last post was over a year ago, and the comments were flooded with condolences. He was dead. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process what I was looking at. My father, the man who had looked me in the eye that night and thrown me away like I was nothing, was gone. There was no sadness, no grief, just a strange, hollow feeling spreading through my chest. I scrolled through the posts, seeing the same phrases over and over again. Gone too soon. Rest in peace. He was a good man. He wasn't. I exhaled slowly, running a hand over my face before typing the next name. Madison. I didn't know what I expected to find. Maybe that she had gotten married, had kids, built the life she had so easily stolen from me. But what I found was worse. Her name was everywhere. News articles, Facebook posts, local discussion boards. I clicked on the first link, my eyes scanning the words as a sick sense of dread settled in my gut. Madison Hayes, local schoolteacher, missing since last Friday. Missing. I read it twice, 3 times, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Madison had disappeared. She had left work as usual, but had never made it home. Her car was still in the school parking lot, her phone found on the front seat. No signs of struggle. No leads. It had been nearly a week, and the police were treating it as a possible abduction. My blood ran cold. The timeline didn't make sense. She had gone missing less than a week ago. My mother had reached out yesterday. There was a connection. There had to be, and I had a sickening feeling that I already knew what it was. The night my life was destroyed, the night my family turned their backs on me, it had been because of her. Because of what she said. Because of the lie that came out of her mouth so effortlessly, so convincingly, that no one even questioned it. Madison had accused me of sexual assault. I hadn't understood at first. I had been blindsided, sitting in that room with my mother crying, my uncle barely containing his rage, my father speaking to me like I was a criminal. I kept waiting for the moment when they would realize the insanity of what they were saying, when they would take a second to actually ask me for my side of the story. That moment never came. Madison had cried, told them that I had done something to her at a party, that she had been too scared to say anything before. There was no evidence, no proof, just her word against mine. And they had believed her without hesitation. They had thrown me away without looking back. Let me walk out that door with nothing. My name already tainted beyond repair. I had spent years trying to forget the sound of my father's voice when he told me that I disgusted him. Trying to forget the look in my mother's eyes when she didn't defend me. Trying to forget the feeling of my entire world collapsing in on itself. Leaving me standing alone in the wreckage of a life that had once been mine. And now, after all this time, Madison was the one who had disappeared. And my family was suddenly reaching out, after a decade of silence. I knew what they wanted. They wanted to know if I had anything to do with it. I let out a slow breath, staring at my phone, the weight of it heavy in my hand. I should have felt anger. I should have felt rage. But all I felt was calm clarity. They had taken everything from me, and now, for the first time, they were the ones afraid. I wasn't going to give them what they wanted. I wasn't going to respond. Because if there was one thing I had learned in 10 years, it was this: sometimes silence is the most powerful weapon of all. And they were finally about to understand what it felt like to be on the other side of it. For 10 years, my family had erased me. Now, they were desperate to bring me back. I didn't respond to my mother's message. I didn't need to. I knew what she wanted. She wasn't reaching out because she missed me or because she wanted to make things right. She wasn't trying to apologize, to reconnect, to acknowledge the decade of silence that stretched between us like a corpse no one wanted to bury. She was reaching out because they were afraid. Madison was missing, and I was the first person they thought of. I could picture it perfectly. My uncle pacing back and forth in his house, his voice sharp, his movements frantic, trying to convince himself that Madison would turn up at any moment. My mother wringing her hands, whispering that they should wait before making assumptions. But her voice would be thin, unsure. The rest of the family, sitting around in uneasy silence, exchanging nervous glances as a single thought hovered over them like a specter, they were too afraid to speak aloud. What if Ethan had something to do with this? The thought must have started as a whisper, a nagging little itch that none of them wanted to acknowledge. But then it would have grown, spreading like rot, infecting every conversation, twisting their perception until it became certainty. It didn't matter that they had no proof, no reason to believe I had anything to do with Madison's disappearance. It didn't matter that I had stayed as far away from them as possible for the last decade, because in their minds, I had every reason to hate her. And that was enough. At first, I ignored the messages. My mother sent another one the next day, her words more urgent this time, as if she could feel my indifference bleeding through the silence. Then my aunt, softer in her approach, asking if I was okay, if I had heard about what happened. Then my cousin Liam, someone I hadn't spoken to since I was a teenager, writing that he didn't know the full story back then, but that he hoped I was doing well. And then, finally, my uncle, Madison's father. I stared at his name on the screen, my pulse slow, steady. He had once told me to my face that I was dead to him, that I was a disgrace, a stain on the family name, that I should be grateful they weren't pressing charges. He had looked at me like I was filth, something to be discarded and forgotten. And now, he was reaching out. I opened the message, expecting anger, accusations, desperation. But instead, it was short, simple. Ethan, I don't care what happened between us. I just need to know if you had anything to do with Madison's disappearance. Please, please. I let out a slow breath, my lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. They were scared. For the first time in 10 years, they were the ones sitting in the dark, waiting, wondering, questioning everything they thought they knew. They had spent a decade pretending I never existed, and now I was all they could think about. I didn't respond. Instead, I let them stew in their own paranoia. Because the longer I stayed silent, the more their fear would grow. I spent the rest of the day gathering every bit of information I could find. I scrolled through news articles, rewatched the press conferences, absorbed every detail the police had released. Madison had been reported missing after she failed to show up for work. Her coworkers had been the ones to raise the alarm, saying she was never late, never skipped a day without telling someone. Her car was found in the school parking lot, the doors locked. Her phone was on the front seat, cracked but still on. No signs of forced entry. No clear evidence of a struggle. The police had been careful with their wording. There were no confirmed suspects, no known threats, no indications that she had left willingly. Just a void where she used to be. But then, something changed. An anonymous tip came in. Someone had called the police, claiming that I had been seen in town a few days before Madison disappeared. I read the article twice, my mind processing the words, my heart slow and measured. The report was vague. Whoever had made the call hadn't given specific details, only that they believed they had seen me. The police hadn't confirmed whether they were looking into it, hadn't publicly declared me a suspect. But I knew what was happening. My family had done this. I could see it playing out in my head. My uncle, filled with grief and rage, gripping his phone, dialing the number with shaking hands, planting the seed in the police's mind. Maybe it had been my mother, or one of my aunts, or one of my old cousins trying to ingratiate themselves back into the family by throwing my name into the fire. It didn't matter who it was, because this was exactly what they had done 10 years ago. No proof, no evidence, no hisetaschen, just a name and an assumption, and suddenly I was the villain again. But this time I wasn't 19. I wasn't a helpless kid standing in a room full of people who had already decided my fate. I wasn't a boy begging his family to believe him, to give him a chance to speak, to fight for his own name. I was a man who had spent a decade learning how to survive. I was a man who knew how to stay 10 steps ahead. And for the first time, I realized something that sent a slow, dark thrill through me. They didn't know who I had become. For 10 years, they had convinced themselves that I was gone, that I had disappeared into nothingness, that I had withered away into an empty name they never had to speak again. And now I was back in their heads, crawling under their skin, keeping them awake at night. I glanced at my phone, scanning the missed calls. blocked numbers, unfamiliar area codes. I ignored them all, but one name stood out, an old contact I had never expected to need again. I called the number, waiting as it rang, my fingers tapping idly against the table. A deep voice answered on the third ring, rough and familiar. I told him what I needed, and just like that, the game changed. Because if my family wanted to play dirty, I could play too. And I had 10 years of silence to make up for. For 10 years, I had lived in the shadow of a lie. For 10 years, I had carried the weight of an accusation that had destroyed me, ripped me from my family, and left me with nothing but my own anger. For 10 years, they had erased me, and now, suddenly, they wanted me back. Not because they had realized they were wrong, not because they missed me, but because they were afraid. The anonymous tip to the police had changed everything. Someone had told them I had been seen in town before Madison disappeared. I hadn't. I hadn't set foot anywhere near them in years. But it didn't matter, just like it hadn't mattered 10 years ago when Madison had pointed a finger at me, and they had all believed her without hesitation. This was the cycle repeating itself. Only this time, I wasn't 19. I wasn't powerless. I was in control. I stared at my phone, reading the latest message from my mother, her words growing more desperate, her pleas bordering on hysteria. My uncle had messaged me again, too. This time, his tone had changed. It wasn't just about Madison anymore. The police had asked about me. They were looking into me. I almost laughed. They had thrown me away a decade ago, and yet the moment things started falling apart, they were pulling me back into the story. But this time, I wasn't going to let them write the ending. I made a call, the same one I had made the night before. The voice on the other end answered, calm and controlled. I told him it was time. Then, for the first time in 10 years, I drove home. The town looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had just grown too big for it. The roads were the same, the houses unchanged, but there was a strange detachment as I drove past old landmarks that should have meant something. The gas station where I had worked my first job, the coffee shop where I used to meet friends, the park where we had spent summers as kids. Nothing felt real. By the time I pulled up to my uncle's house, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the driveway. There were cars parked outside. Not just his, but my mother's, my aunt's, a few others I recognized. They were all here. I stepped out of the car, taking my time, letting the cool evening air settle against my skin. I knew they had seen me. I could feel them watching from inside, trying to decide what to do. Then finally, the door opened. My mother stepped out first. She looked older, more tired, her face lined with the weight of the years that had passed. But it was the look in her eyes that struck me the most. She was afraid. She said my name, her voice breaking slightly, as if she still wasn't sure if I was real. I didn't answer. Behind her, my uncle appeared. His face was hard, suspicious, but there was something else beneath it, something that looked a lot like guilt. They had spent 10 years pretending I didn't exist, and now they didn't know what to do with the fact that I was standing right in front of them. I took a slow step forward. "Where's Madison?" The question hit them like a slap. My mother flinched. My uncle's expression twisted into something defensive, like he had been waiting for me to say those words. "You tell us," he said. His voice was sharp, but I could hear the uncertainty beneath it. I exhaled, shaking my head. "You still don't get it, do you?" My voice was calm, measured, because I had already won. I had nothing to do with this. He didn't respond, because for the first time, I think he realized he didn't believe his own accusation. For 10 years, he had convinced himself I was a monster, because that was easier than admitting the truth. Easier than admitting that the daughter he had protected, defended, and believed over everything else had been lying the entire time. And now, with Madison missing, with nothing but shadows and uncertainty to hold on to, he had finally started to doubt himself. The front door creaked open again. More people stepped outside. My aunt, my cousins, people who had once been my family, but now felt like strangers. And then, finally, a voice I hadn't heard in a decade. Of course he didn't do it. The voice was Madison's. I turned slowly, and there she was, standing in the doorway. Not missing, not abducted, not dead, very much alive. There was a long, horrible silence. I could feel the weight of every gaze shifting between me and her, like no one knew what the hell was happening. "You look surprised," I said, my voice sharp, watching my uncle's face drain of color. Madison stepped forward, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. But I knew that look. The same look she had given me 10 years ago, when she had stood in a room full of people and burned my life to the ground with a single accusation. "You let them think you were dead," I said, realization hitting me in waves. "You let them think I did something to you." She didn't deny it. My uncle turned to her, his face twisted in confusion, in betrayal, because I think for the first time, he realized that he had been wrong, that he had been wrong about everything. Madison exhaled, shaking her head. "I needed to get away," she said simply, like it was nothing, like it was normal to fake your own disappearance and let the world believe you had been abducted. And suddenly I understood. She had set me up again. She had let them turn their fear toward me, knowing that if the police started looking for a suspect, my name would be the first one out of their mouths. She had disappeared, but she had never been in danger. She had just been watching, waiting. But I had ruined her plan. I had come back. And now, she was standing there, exposed, in front of the same family she had manipulated a decade ago, and they were finally starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, they had backed the wrong horse. I smiled, and for the first time in my life, I watched as Madison was the one left speechless. The end.